Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer. Look, if you're the kind of person who is deeply fascinated by the foundational rules of our universe, the real nuts and bolts of how everything actually works, you are absolutely in the right place today. Our source material presents this genuinely paradigm-shifting hypothesis about the true nature of reality. And it argues that the stage we all live on, space-time itself, might not be at all what we've always thought it was. We aren't just talking about abstract, high-level mathematical models here. We are talking about the literal fabric of every single second you experience and every inch of space you cross on your morning commute. If this hypothesis holds true, it basically demands that we completely dismantle our traditional, everyday understanding of physical existence and then meticulously rebuild it from the ground up, using nothing but a purely thermodynamic foundation. It's a huge shift. So get comfortable, clear your mind, and let's unravel the cosmos together. To really truly grasp this new framework, we have to start with a thought experiment. I want you to genuinely imagine a universe completely stripped of all physical change. Absolute, terrifying stillness. Nothing shifts, nothing degrades, nothing evolves. Imagine every single atom, every quantum fluctuation, just perfectly and eternally suspended in place. Now, intuitively, as humans, we assume that even in a totally frozen universe like that, time would still tick by in the background, right? We assume space would still sit there as this vast, empty room just waiting to be filled again. We think the stage would remain, even if all the actors stopped moving. But our source strictly challenges that exact core assumption. So let's break down what actually happens in a reality with absolutely zero physical progression. We're going to go step by step, and you'll see exactly why our classical intuition might just be fundamentally flawed.
First up, let's consider mechanical time. Clocks do not tick. But I want you to think really deeply about what a clock actually is at a physical level. Whether you're talking about the big macroscopic swinging pendulum of an antique grandfather clock, or the tiny vibrating quartz crystal inside your wristwatch, or even the incredibly precise atomic decay measured in some multi-million-dollar laboratory instrument. Measuring time intrinsically relies on a physical process actually occurring. It fundamentally requires a state changing from point A to point B. In our perfectly frozen universe thought experiment, all of those mechanisms are halted entirely. The literal gears freeze, the microscopic vibrations stop dead, the atomic transitions simply cease. Without that underlying physical progression taking place, the mechanical measurement of time ceases to exist entirely. There is literally no quantifiable next moment to record. Time, as a measurable real-world metric, completely vanishes.
Now take that exact same logic and apply it to space. Particles do not move. If everything is absolutely perfectly frozen, spatial movement halts entirely. Think about how we actually practically comprehend distance in our everyday lives. We understand it by the physical effort or the time it takes to get from one point to another, right? Or we understand it by observing the distinct, separate positions of physical matter interacting over a gap. But if no particle ever shifts its position, if absolutely nothing ever crosses a vacuum, the very concept of distance begins to lose its physical meaning entirely. Without the capacity for things to traverse a gap, or the shifting of relative coordinates between objects, the geographic and geometric markers we rely on to navigate a three-dimensional world, they are completely eradicated. And it goes even deeper into the fundamental physics of our reality than just solid objects. Light does not propagate. You have to remember, light is the absolute fundamental speed limit of our universe. It's the ultimate cosmic messenger that carries information and causality from one corner of a galaxy to another. But in a universe devoid of change, even this incredibly dynamic, energetic wave freezes perfectly in place. Imagine a photon emitted from a distant star that just never reaches a planet. The entire electromagnetic field is locked in a static, unmoving configuration. And here's why that matters. Without light traveling, there is absolutely no transfer of energy. There's no transmission of visual information. There's no cause and effect spanning across the cosmos. The universe becomes utterly and totally disconnected, severing the very causal threads that weave the fabric of space-time together in the first place.
Let's ground this highly abstract physics concept into our own everyday human reality. Observers cannot make memories. See, our perception of time passing is incredibly intimately tied to our psychological experience, specifically our brain's ability to continuously encode new memories. But memory formation isn't magic. It is a highly complex physical and chemical process. It literally requires neurons to fire, neurotransmitters to physically cross synapses, and structural, biological changes to happen within the brain itself. If the universe has zero physical change, your cognitive progression entirely ceases. It's not like you would be trapped in a frozen moment, agonizingly aware of the stillness around you. No, your awareness itself would be perfectly paused. The entire subjective, conscious experience of time flowing relies 100% on physiological change happening in your head.
The crucial takeaway here is captured perfectly by our source material, and it says, in such a state, time flowing and moving through space are indistinguishable. When you strip away every single mechanical tick, every particle's quantum movement, every propagating beam of light, and every firing biological neuron, you are not left with an empty, waiting container of space and time. You literally cannot tell the difference between time passing and space existing, because without any underlying physical change, neither of those concepts has any physical reality left to anchor it. In a state of absolute stasis, the entire geometry of reality dissolves into a totally meaningless void, where spatial dimensions and chronological duration become completely irrelevant and honestly structurally identical.
So, this brings us to the grand pivot of the whole theory. If time and space totally vanish without change, how do we identify them in the first place when things are moving? The only key is entropic change. Our source argues that it is specifically the irreversible progression of thermodynamic states, the arrow of entropy itself, that actually gives rise to the measurable concepts of time and space. We are not just talking about arbitrary, random movement here. We are talking about the fundamental tendency of closed systems to always move toward thermal equilibrium. It's a one-way street. It is this highly specific unidirectional gradient of physical states that allows the universe to have a chronological sequence and a spatial architecture at all. Without that entropic gradient continuously driving the universe forward, time and space simply do not exist. Period.
To really fully appreciate how revolutionary this idea is, we need to set up a bit of a contrast. On one side, we have the established view of mainstream physics. This is the perspective rooted heavily in classical mechanics and standard relativity, the stuff you learn in high school and college. On the other side, we have the new hypothesis proposed by our source today. It is absolutely vital to thoroughly understand our current scientific baseline before we can see exactly how this new framework completely upends our traditional understanding of reality. We are looking at a fundamental, massive epistemological shift in how we categorize the very building blocks of the universe. We're moving away from rigid structural assumptions and moving toward a purely process-driven reality.
Let's start with the baseline. In mainstream physics, space-time is treated as a fundamental, pre-existing geometric structure. I want you to think of it like a vast, invisible theater stage. Entropy, and all the incredibly complex thermodynamic processes that generate it, like massive stars burning through nuclear fusion, whole galaxies colliding, supermassive black holes accreting matter, all of those are merely the actors performing on that stage. In this traditional background-dependent view, the stage exists entirely independently of the actors. Even if every single particle, wave, and field were completely removed from the universe, the stage of spacetime would theoretically still just sit there, totally empty but fundamentally real. In this view, entropy is categorized simply as a property of the material that happens to be interacting inside the container.
But here comes the reversal. This new hypothesis flips that classical relationship completely upside down. It proposes that spacetime is actually emergent, and that entropy is the true foundational structure of reality. Going back to our theater analogy, the actors aren't just performing on some pre-existing independent stage. The immense, complex interactions and the entropic processes of the actors are what actively create the stage beneath their feet. Entropy isn't just something happening inside spacetime. Rather, the very phenomenon of entropy progressing through physical states builds the macro illusion of the container we call spacetime. The background geometry is entirely 100% dependent on the thermodynamic processes that are occurring. And this brings us to what I think is the absolute climax of this explanation, a profound conclusion straight from the text. Spacetime itself emerges from the structure of entropic change. Let that sink in for a second. It suggests the universe isn't a place where things happen. The universe is the happening of things. The rigid, mathematical geometry we measure with our atomic clocks and our massive laser interferometers, that's just a secondary effect. Think about temperature. Just as temperature is an emergent macro property of rapidly moving microscopic molecules, like you literally cannot point to one single isolated molecule and call it hot, spacetime is an emergent macro property of shifting entropy at the quantum level. It is the macro-level structure seamlessly generated by countless micro-level entropic changes occurring in tandem, everywhere, all at once.
So if we operate under this totally new framework, how do we redefine the fundamental components of our daily reality? Our source states that time and space are simply different expressions of the exact same underlying mechanism, entropy change. Because they share an identical thermodynamic source, they can finally be defined symmetrically. They are not these vastly different beasts operating under totally different physical laws. They are quite literally two sides of the exact same entropic coin. This symmetry offers a really beautiful simplification to the often contradictory realms of physics. It strongly suggests that what we perceive as vastly different dimensions, length, width, height, and time, are actually just alternative interpretations of the exact same progressive physical reality.
Let's unpack these new definitions, starting with time. In this framework, time is simply the sequence of entropy change. It is elegantly simple yet vastly, vastly powerful. When entropy increases in a closed system, it inherently creates a rigid, unbreakable chain of events. State A progresses into state B, which then irreversibly degrades into state C. The sequential ordering of those entropic events, the undeniable physical fact that one highly specific higher entropy state definitively, undeniably, follows a lower entropy state, is exactly what our brains perceive as time. Time is simply the universe's internal filing system for cataloging the chronological sequence of structural breakdown and thermodynamic evolution. Immediately following that exact same logic, we have the new spatial definition. Space is defined here as the direction and relationship of entropy change. So if time is the strict sequence of those changing thermodynamic states, space is the incredibly complex relational web of how those changing states physically interact with each other. When an entropic event happens anywhere, it has a directional, physical impact on the quantum fields and the matter immediately surrounding it. The way these billions of individual events relate to one another, the way they distance themselves or connect directionally across a massive system, forms a vast, interconnected relational network. It is that specific, interconnected relational aspect of entropic progression that our human brains and our scientific instruments interpret as three-dimensional space.
So how does this all build into a grand synthesis? Well, the ultimate holy grail of fundamental physics has always been unification. And the unified definition proposed by our source is that spacetime as a singular cohesive entity is quite simply the total structure of entropy changes. It is the comprehensive, overarching blueprint of all sequential and relational thermodynamic changes happening simultaneously across reality. By pushing this hypothesis to its absolute logical conclusion, physicists wouldn't have to awkwardly stitch space and time together through insanely complex mathematical workarounds anymore. Space and time are intrinsically unified right out of the box, because they are just the overall architecture of a universe that is constantly, fundamentally changing its entropic state.
When we look at the final symmetry of this hypothesis, it actually resolves a lot of the classical complexities that have plagued theoretical physics for decades. Traditionally, time and space are treated as totally independent foundational pillars, and that often creates massive friction when you try to combine different fields of physics together, like quantum mechanics and general relativity. But under this new framework, it is so much cleaner. Time is merely the sequential aspect of entropic structure. Space is merely the relational aspect of that exact same structure. They are no longer independent concepts that just happen to interact with one another. They are entirely dependent. They are simply two distinct ways of looking at one single foundational reality, the irreversible structural progression of entropy. So as we wrap this up, I really want to leave you with a question to chew on. Is your perception of passing time merely an illusion created by entropic change? Think about it. Every single second you physically feel ticking by, every vivid memory you form in your brain, the very physical distance between you and the screen you're looking at right now, if this source material is correct, absolutely none of it is a fundamental property of reality. It is all a beautiful, incredibly complex macro illusion generated by the relentless, irreversible march of entropy at the microscopic level. It completely reframes what it fundamentally means to exist as a conscious observer in this universe. I highly recommend thinking about that the next time you look at a clock or gaze out into the night sky. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the profound nature of your reality.